Welcome to our deep dive today. And, we're going to be looking at English grammar,
Ooh, fun.
right? It could be intimidating, I think, to some people,
Yeah,
but I'm excited about this one.
me too.
And we're going to be using this comprehensive grammar guide that you gave me as our source.
Yes,
And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what we can learn about how to improve our communication through a better understanding of grammar.
absolutely. And you know what's interesting is so many people think about grammar as just this set of, rigid rules
Right.
that you have to follow, but it's really much more than that.
Yeah.
It's really about clarity and precision.
It's a framework.
Yeah, it's a framework.
Yeah, and I think the source material even talks about how it can be empowering
Yes.
to approach grammar in that way rather than as a set of restrictions.
Exactly.
Yeah,
The more you understand how language works, the more control you have over how you use it.
just like having the right tools to build a house.
Yes.
If you have a good foundation, you've got all the right tools, you can really build anything.
Exactly.
And I think that's a great way to think about grammar. So let's kind of get into the nuts and bolts here.
Okay.
When we talk about parts of speech,
Yes.
why are those so important? I mean.
Sure. Well, parts of speech are essentially the building blocks of language.
Yeah.
They're like the ingredients in a recipe.
Right.
You have to understand what each ingredient does in order to put together a delicious dish.
Right.
And it's the same with language. You need to know what nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs are and how they function so that you can,
Put them all together.
put them all together to create meaning.
And our source material even uses this great example. She quickly ran to the park,
Oh, that's a good one.
and just the word quickly there,
Yeah.
being able to identify that as an adverb
Yes.
really kind of unlocks another layer of the meaning of that sentence.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people actually get confused between adjectives and adverbs.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Sometimes people might say she sings beautiful when they actually mean to say she sings beautifully.
Right.
So it's a small difference, but it changes the meaning.
It does. I think that was something that I even learned from the source material. I didn't realize that there was like a whole school of thought.
Oh, interesting.
It's like grammar shouldn't be these restrictive rules. It should be.
More about understanding the choices that you have.
Yes.
And using those choices strategically to communicate your ideas effectively.
That's really neat. I like that. Okay. So we've talked about those building blocks. Now, let's move on to sentence structure.
Okay.
That was always something that I struggled with in school.
Right.
And subject, verb, object, we were just talking about that before we started recording.
Yeah.
That's really like the most basic structure of a sentence.
Yes, it's the foundation.
But then it can get really complicated when you start adding, independent and dependent clauses.
Right.
And you start mixing simple sentences with compound sentences and complex sentences.
Right. Absolutely. And you can kind of think about it like building a house. You can have a simple one-story structure.
Right.
Or you can have something that's much more intricate with, multiple levels and wings and all sorts of interesting additions.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of things that can make sentences complicated, how do you feel about sentence fragments in run-on sentences?
Those are tricky.
Yeah, I think we've all probably been guilty of those at some point.
Definitely. And it can be hard to spot them in your own writing, but it's important to be aware of them and to develop strategies for fixing them.
Well, and our source material, I thought, had some really good tips for how to avoid those common mistakes.
Yes,
So hopefully we'll be able to use those in our own writing.
for sure.
So moving right along, let's talk about punctuation.
Okay.
I remember our grammar guide made this comparison of punctuation marks to traffic signals.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
And I thought that was brilliant
I think
because it really is, it's guiding the reader through the text.
It is. It's giving them signals about where to pause, where to stop. Exactly. Yeah.
And you know how to interpret the meaning.
It's like breathing marks in music.
Yes,
It tells you where to breathe, where to phrase things.
exactly.
Okay, so let's start with kind of the most basic punctuation mark, the comma.
The comma, yeah.
What are some common ways that we use commas?
So many ways we use commas to separate items in a list,
Right.
to set off introductory phrases, to join independent clauses with a conjunction, and so on.
I feel like commas are one of those things that everybody thinks they know how to use,
Yes,
but then you realize there are all these like subtle rules
exactly.
that can really trip you up.
Yes, and there are a lot of gray areas with commas where it's really a matter of style and preference.
Right.
But the most important thing is to be consistent.
Okay. So how about semicolons? Are those as scary as people make them out to be?
No, not at all.
Right.
Semicolons are just a way of connecting two closely related independent clauses without using a conjunction.
Okay.
So it's kind of like a stronger pause than a comma,
Hmm.
but not quite as strong as a period. Gotcha.
Okay.
Okay. So colons, those are a little more straightforward. Usually it's just for introducing a list or an explanation.
Exactly.
Right.
Like, here are three things I love about grammar:
Yeah.
clarity, precision, and the ability to express complex ideas.
Perfect. Okay, what about apostrophes? I
Yeah.
think that's one that always trips people up, especially it's versus is.
Yes. That's a common mistake.
Yeah.
But there's an easy way to remember it.
Oh,
It's is a contraction for it is or it has.
Right.
It's is possessive.
Okay.
So it's like his or her.
Okay.
So if you can replace the word with it is or it has, then you need the apostrophe.
That's a really good tip. I'm
Yeah.
gonna use that.
Good.
Okay. Question marks, exclamation points. Those are pretty straightforward, I think.
Yeah.
Any fun facts about those?
Well, it's interesting to note that the use of exclamation points has become much more common in informal writing these days,
Mm.
especially on social media. It's a way to add emphasis and express emotion, but I think it's important to use them sparingly.
Right, or they lose their power.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's move on to the big one, verb tenses.
Ooh, yes.
I know this is something that a lot of people struggle with, myself included.
Yeah, verb tenses can be tricky.
They tell us when an action happens past, present, future.
Exactly.
But then there are all the variations,
Mhm.
simple, continuous, perfect continuous.
Right, right.
How do you keep all of that straight?
Well, our source material has these really helpful timeline diagrams
Oh, yeah.
that visually represent how each tense works.
Yeah.
It's like you can actually see on a timeline when the action is happening and how long it lasts.
Right. And I think it's fascinating because just a very subtle change in the tense
Yes,
can completely change the meaning of the sentence.
absolutely. Like the difference between I eat breakfast every day
Right.
and I am eating breakfast right now.
Exactly.
It's a completely different meaning.
And speaking of tricky verbs, let's not forget about irregular verbs.
Oh, yes.
Those are always fun.
Those are the tricky ones.
Do you have any tips for people who are maybe trying to memorize those?
Well, flashcards are always helpful,
Yeah.
and verb conjugation charts, and there are also a lot of online resources that you can use.
Yeah.
And just practice, practice, practice.
Yeah. Repetition is key.
Yes.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the basics here, but
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the most common pitfalls that people should watch out for when it comes to grammar?
Well, one of the most common mistakes I see is subject-verb agreement,
Okay.
making sure that the verb agrees with the subject in number.
So like the team is versus the team are.
Exactly.
Yeah,
People get tripped up on that one all the time.
that's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and our source material also mentions something about neither nor constructions being tricky.
Oh, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So with neither nor, the verb needs to agree with the subject that's closest to it.
Okay,
So, for example, you would say, neither the students nor the teacher knows the answer,
gotcha.
because teacher is singular. But you would say, neither the teacher nor the students know the answer, because students is plural.
So it's about proximity,
Yes.
not just the order in which the subjects appear.
Exactly.
That's interesting. I'm going to keep that one in mind.
Hmm.
Another area that I'd always struggle with is pronoun confusion,
Oh, yeah.
especially I versus me and who versus whom.
Right. Those can be tricky, but there's a simple rule to remember.
Right.
I is always the subject of the verb.
Right.
Me is always the object.
Okay.
And for who versus whom, if you can replace the word with he or she, then use who. If you can replace it with him or her, then use whom.
Okay, so if it's a subject, it's who. If it's an object, it's whom.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, our source material also talks about the use of the singular they, them,
Yes.
and how that's become more common in modern English.
Right. And that's really a reflection of the evolving nature of language. It's
Yeah.
a way to be more inclusive and gender neutral when we're referring to someone whose gender is unknown or who identifies as non-binary.
It's interesting how language is always changing to reflect the changes in society.
Absolutely.
I think that's one of the things that makes grammar so fascinating. Okay, so I feel like we've covered a lot of ground here,
We have
but we've only just scratched the surface.
just the tip of the iceberg.
Right, and I'm already, like, my brain is getting a workout here.
Me too.
So listeners, get ready, because in part 2 of our deep dive, we're going to go even deeper and we're going to explore some advanced grammar concepts.
Yeah.
They're going to help you take your communication to a whole new level.
I'm excited.
You too.
Welcome back to our deep dive into English grammar. We explored a lot of fundamental concepts last time, parts of speech sentence structure, punctuation, common grammatical errors. But now it's time to level up
Yes.
and dive into some of the more advanced and nuanced aspects of grammar.
I'm ready.
Are you ready to level up your grammar game?
Let's do it.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about things like the subjunctive mood relative clauses and modals.
Ooh, those are fun.
Those are the fun ones, right?
Yes.
These concepts might sound a bit intimidating at first, but once you understand them, you'll have a whole new set of tools at your disposal.
I remember learning about the subjunctive mood back in school, but it always seems kind of mysterious.
Yeah, it's one of those things that people hear about, but they're not always sure how to use it.
Right.
Mm.
Can you break it down for us in a way that actually makes sense?
Of course. So the subjunctive mood is a way of expressing things that aren't necessarily facts, but rather wishes, suggestions, commands, or hypothetical situations.
Okay, so it's like expressing things that aren't concrete or real.
Exactly. It's about those what-ifs and possibilities.
Our source material uses the example, I wish I were there, instead of I wish I was there.
Perfect example.
Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, so in that case, we use were, because the speaker is expressing a wish for something that is not currently true.
Right.
The subjunctive mood helps to signal that this is a hypothetical situation.
So it's about adding a layer of nuance to our language to
Yeah.
express those possibilities.
Exactly. And you might even say that the subjunctive mood can be persuasive.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, think about phrases like, if I were you, or it's important that she be present.
Right.
They kind of create a sense of authority and urgency.
They do.
It's subtle, but it can be very effective.
So it's not just about grammar rules, it's about using language strategically.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's move on to relative clauses. Those were another one that I always found a little bit tricky.
Yeah, relative clauses are clauses that give you additional information about a noun or pronoun in the main clause.
Okay.
They're kind of like little detours that add more detail to your sentences.
Our grammar guide gave the example, the book that I read versus the book which I read was thrilling.
Yeah.
Could you explain the difference?
Sure. So that I read is a defining relative clause. It tells you which book the speaker is referring to.
Okay.
Which I read is a non-defining relative clause. It gives you extra information about the book, but it's not essential to the meaning of the sentence.
So it's about whether the information is crucial to understanding the sentence.
Exactly.
Okay, and I remember from our source material that we use different relative pronouns,
Yes.
depending on what we're modifying.
Right. You use who for people, which for things, and that can be used for both.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's talk about modals now.
Modals.
Those little helper verbs.
Those are fun.
Yeah, I love those because they can add so much subtle meaning to our verbs.
They're like little spices that you sprinkle into your sentences to give them more flavor and nuance.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So our source material highlighted the difference between could you help me, which is a polite request,
Yes.
versus you should help me, which is advice or an obligation.
Exactly.
And it's amazing how just changing that one little word
Yes.
can completely change the tone and meaning of what you're saying.
Absolutely.
It's all about those subtle shades of meaning.
It is.
What are some other interesting ways that we can use modals?
Well, you can think about the difference between you must help me, which is a strong obligation,
Right.
versus you might want to consider helping me, which is just a suggestion.
Right.
Or I can do it, which is about ability, versus I should do it, which is about obligation.
It's like having a whole palette of colors
It is.
to choose from when you're painting a picture.
That's beautiful.
Okay, so we've covered some pretty advanced concepts here.
We have.
The subjunctive mood relative clauses and modals.
Yes.
My brain is getting a workout,
Me too.
and I hope our listeners are feeling the same way.
I hope so.
But it's not just about theory, right?
No.
It's about how we can actually use these tools in our everyday communication.
Exactly. So in the next part of our deep dives, we're going to bring it all together.
Okay.
We'll discuss the differences between formal and informal English, some helpful editing tools, and how you can learn grammar through immersion.
Welcome back to our grammar deep dive. We've made it to part 3.
We have.
And, we've talked about so much already. From the basic building blocks of language to some really, complex and advanced topics.
Right.
But now I think it's time to kind of shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and think about how we can actually apply all of this knowledge in our everyday lives.
Right, because grammar isn't just about knowing the rules, it's about using those rules effectively.
Exactly. And one of the things I think is so important to consider is the level of formality.
Yes.
And our source material talks about, the differences between formal and informal English.
Right. Formal English is what you would use in academic writing, professional settings, or when you're addressing someone you don't know very well.
Right. So it's like putting on your best outfit
Exactly.
for a special occasion.
Yes.
You want to make a good impression.
Yes.
I thought the source material had a really good example about email etiquette.
Oh, yeah.
Using "Hi, John" versus "Dear Mr. Smith."
Right. You would use "Hi, John" if you're emailing a friend or a close colleague.
Right.
But you would use "Dear Mr. Smith" if you're emailing someone you don't know very well or someone in a position of authority.
It's about choosing the right register for the situation.
Exactly.
Like you wouldn't wear jeans and a T-shirt to a job interview.
Exactly.
So, and then on the flip side, you've got informal English.
Right.
Which is more relaxed and conversational.
Yes, and it's perfectly fine to use contraction slang and a more casual tone.
In those situations.
Yes, when you're with friends and family or on social media.
It's about being authentic.
Yes.
Yeah. But I imagine it can be tricky sometimes.
It can.
To know when to switch between those two.
It is, and it takes practice and paying attention to how language is being used around you.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about editing. I think even the most experienced writers
Absolutely.
need to edit their work
Yes.
carefully to make sure it's clear and concise and error-free.
It's essential.
What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think editing is like polishing a gem. You start with something that has potential.
Right. But it's the polishing that really makes it shine.
And our source material talks about some helpful tools.
Yes.
Like Grammarly and the Hemingway editor.
Yes. Those are great tools for catching those little grammar and spelling mistakes.
And they can help you simplify your writing.
Yes, and make it more readable.
Yeah. Those are good ones. But I think it's important to remember that
You're not perfect.
they're not foolproof.
Yeah, they can't replace your own judgment and critical thinking.
Right. Still have to use our brains.
Exactly.
And I also remember our grammar guide emphasizes the importance of proofreading
Yes.
carefully. And I think even reading your work aloud can be really helpful.
Oh, absolutely, because you can hear how it sounds and you
Yeah.
can catch those awkward phrases.
Yeah. Have you ever tried backward editing?
I have.
That's where you read your work from the last sentence to the first.
Yes. It's a great way to force yourself to look at each sentence individually.
That's a good tip. I'm going to try that one. Now, our source material also talked about learning grammar through immersion.
Yes.
It's not just about memorizing rules and definitions. It's about experiencing language in action.
Right, and that's why it's so important to read and listen and engage in conversations as much as possible.
Yeah, I think I've learned so much about grammar just by paying attention to how it's used in my favorite books and podcasts.
Me too.
Yeah, and our source material even mentioned shadowing exercises, where you mimic native speakers
Oh, yes.
to improve your pronunciation and fluency.
That's a fun one.
It's like having a language coach right there with you.
It is.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our grammar deep dive.
We have.
It's been quite a journey,
It has.
and I feel like I've learned so much. What are your final thoughts?
I hope this deep dive has been insightful and empowering. I think the most important thing to remember is that grammar is not just about following rules. It's a tool for communication.
It's about expressing yourself clearly and effectively. Yeah, and to kind of wrap things up, our grammar guide leaves us with this thought-provoking question. How can you apply what you've learned about grammar to enhance your own communication and make your writing more impactful?
That's a great question to reflect on, and I encourage everyone to keep exploring the world of grammar. There's always something new to learn.
That's so true, and I want to thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to all of our listeners out there, keep learning, keep practicing, and keep playing with language.